Hi everybody, welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at the third semantic segmentation model in this module called DeeplabV3+. As you can read below in the notes, there are several different versions of the DeepLab architecture that were developed over a period of time starting in 2014. And we've provided the links to the associated research papers for 4 different versions of the model and also the GitHub repository for the project. In this notebook, we'll be specifically modeling the DeeplabV3+ architecture. This particular architecture addresses 2 well-known problems from that time period with semantic segmentation models. In the encoder portion of most networks where feature extraction is performed, consecutive pooling operations reduce the resolution of the feature maps, which can lead to a loss of information. And another difficulty comes from the existence of objects at multiple scales. So to help mitigate these problems, the DeeplabV3+ architecture makes use of Artruce dilated spatial pyramid pooling, which allows the model to extract features at different scales. With Artruce convolution, you can control the resolution at which features are extracted, but without requiring extra learnable parameters. Although this architecture is a bit more complicated than the previous models we've reviewed thus far, it still has a basic structure that includes an encoder-decoder type of architecture with main components of feature extraction, one-by-one convolutions, and upsampling operations to reconstruct detailed spatial information to produce the final segmentation map. The key features of this model are the use of dilated convolutions with spatial pyramid pooling that both help to extract and retain important features while minimizing the number of trainable parameters required. In the implementation below, we're going to use the ResNet 50 backbone pre-trained on ImageNet, and as depicted in the architecture diagram, feature maps extracted from specific layers in the ResNet 50 backbone, indicated as A and B in the figure, will be passed through 2 separate downstream processing pipelines, one through a dilated spatial pyramid pooling module and the other along a separate processing path in the decoder that will eventually get concatenated with the output from the encoder module. Before we get into the coding implementation in this notebook, we're going to talk for a little bit about spatial pyramid pooling and how dilated convolutions were used to extend that concept for DeeplabV3+. Spatial pyramid pooling, also known as spatial pyramid matching, has been a very successful and popular method in computer vision, which partitions the image into different granularities before extracting features, and therefore allows the model to detect features of objects at different scales. This technique was first applied to convolutional neural networks back in 2015 and inspired the developers of DeepLab to create an extension of the concept called Artruce spatial pyramid pooling, in which dilated convolutions are used to efficiently extract features at different scales by using different dilation rates. Recall that with dilated convolutions, we can effectively increase the receptive field of view of the kernel without increasing the size of the kernel, as shown in the figure below. And so this was the concept that was used to extend the idea of spatial pyramid pooling to Artruce spatial pyramid pooling. So next, let's take a look at how dilated convolutions are combined with spatial pyramid pooling. At the bottom of the figure, we have some number of lower resolution feature maps that are obtained from a specific layer in the ResNet 50 backbone, which are indicated as the gray region, and although we're not showing the depth, in this example the number of channels is 256. These are then passed through the Artruce spatial pyramid pooling module, where each feature map is processed by 4 parallel filters. Other than the 1x1 filter shown at the far left, the other 3 filters use 3x3 kernels, but with different dilation rates to achieve different size receptor fields on the input feature maps, which lead to capturing features at different scales. And then the outputs from each filter are concatenated together to aggregate all the features. So for example, the smaller receptive field would be good at extracting features of objects that have a smaller scale in the original image, and the larger receptive field would capture features of objects that have a larger scale. So the output from this module will have a shape that's proportional to the input image size, which is what we want for a segmentation model, since these intermediate representations will be upsampled to the same size as the input image. So a model constructed in this way will produce an output that is the same size as the input image. So next, let's take a look at how to implement this model in a modular fashion. And that begins with a convenience function that models a convolutional block consisting of a 2D convolution followed by a batch normalization layer. And notice that this function has several optional arguments that provide a lot of flexibility. Before we have a look at the two remaining functions that are required to implement this model, let's take a look at the architecture diagram. And this time, notice that we've included the shape of the tensors to help you follow along, which I think is a really good way to dissect and understand models by simply keeping track of the tensor shapes. And just to avoid the extra clutter, we've omitted the batch dimension in the figure, and we're only indicating the spatial size and the number of channels. So first, notice that the feature maps that are passed to the Arthrus spatial pyramid pooling module are lower resolution maps that contain 256 channels. The output from each parallel filter in that module is 14 by 14 by 256, and those are then concatenated together and passed through a 1x1 convolutional layer to reduce the number of channels back to 256. Now turning our attention to the second set of feature maps that are extracted from the backbone, notice that these are higher resolution maps, which are passed through a 1x1 convolution, which changes the depth to 256. And then at that point in the decoder, the feature maps that were processed by the encoder are upsampled so that both sets of feature maps are now 56 by 56 by 256, which can be concatenated together and then followed by two 3x3 convolutions, which is then followed by an upsampling by a factor of 4 to restore the spatial dimensions of the data, and then finally pass through a 1x1 convolution to reduce the depth of the final output to the number of classes. So with that overview, let's continue on and take a look at two more functions. This next function handles all the processing associated with a dilated spatial pyramid pooling module. It has one required argument, which are the feature maps obtained from the backbone. And after we extract the spatial dimensions of the input feature maps, we perform global average pooling on the input feature maps to create a 1x1 feature map with 512 channels, followed by a 1x1 convolution to reduce the number of channels to 256, and then finally an upsampling to match the spatial dimensions of the input image. The input feature maps are then also convolved 4 times with different dilation rates of 1, 6, 12, and 18, and the 5 outputs are then concatenated together and passed through another 1x1 convolution operation to reduce the number of channels to 256. The output from this function is then passed to the encoder module for additional processing. Notice that the encoder-decoder architectural structure is more of a conceptual framework, and that we don't need to have functions that model each of those modules explicitly. And by the way, if you have any doubts about the tensor shapes at various processing stages, you can always add some print statements to the code, or what I prefer to do is just put the code in a debugger and step through the code that way. So now let's finally take a look at the main function that's going to implement the entire model. This function takes 2 required arguments, which are the number of classes and the shape of the model input. So we start by using the ResNet 50 model in Keras as the backbone of the architecture that's been pre-trained on ImageNet. And notice that we're not including the fully connected layers, so it's just a convolutional backbone that we're modeling. Then next, we're setting all the layers to be trainable. And then here we're going to obtain an intermediate layer from the ResNet 50 model, which contains the feature maps that we're going to pass through the dilated spatial pyramid pooling module, which performs all the operations that we just described above. And then following that, there's an upsampling operation by a factor of 4 in the decoder. Then next, for input B, we're obtaining a second, higher resolution set of feature maps from the backbone and using a 1x1 convolution to change the depth to 256. And then finally, at this point, A and B can be concatenated together and we can perform the final set of convolutions and upsampling as we described above, followed by a 1x1 convolution with an output depth set to the number of classes, which in this case would be 2. And then finally, we're passing that through a softmax activation function to achieve the final predictions from the model. One thing we wanted to point out here is that the feature maps extracted from the backbone represent specific layers in the backbone given by their name, as we've indicated. So we'd like to emphasize a few things here. First, we're selecting layers that represent the output of a ReLU activation. The layer that was selected for processing through spatial pyramid pooling is a lower resolution layer that contains rich contextual information regarding what is in the image, and the higher resolution layer that's extracted from the backbone and passed to the decoder contains localization information in reference to where objects are located in the image. Also, since there's so many layers in this backbone with specific names and shapes, it's necessary to have a reference to the model in order to select specific layers for extraction. So one thing that's very helpful to do is to print out a model summary and use that as a reference for selecting specific layers. In fact, if you wanted to experiment, you could select different layers from the backbone, but if you do this, you need to be mindful of the amount of upsampling that's required in order to maintain consistent shapes throughout the architecture. So here we've indicated those shapes in the comments, and as we scroll down through the model summary below, you'll be able to identify those specific layers and confirm the shapes. So again, if you wanted to experiment with using different layers, feel free to do so, but you'll need to make sure that the upsampling operations use an appropriate scale factor to maintain the proper spatial dimensions throughout the architecture. So now let's go ahead and use this function to create the model and print the summary. And as we scroll down through the output, you'll see the high resolution layer that we're extracting, which is conv2 block3 2 ReLU, which has a shape of 56 by 56 by 64. And then further below, we have the lower resolution layer, which is conv4 block 6 2 ReLU, which has a shape of 14 by 14 by 256. And then at the very bottom of the summary, let's take a look at the total number of trainable parameters for this model, which is just over 12 million. And if you compare that to the FCN32S and UNet models, you'll see that the FCN model is slightly larger with just over 14 million parameters, but the UNet model has over 31 million parameters. So it's quite a bit larger than the other two. And we'll come back to this further below in the notebook when we compare all three models on this data set, but we just wanted to highlight those differences. So next, we're going to train the model in the same way that we did with the FCN32S and UNet models, with all the same settings as in the previous examples with this data set. So let's go ahead and skip ahead to the training plots and take a look at the results. As you can see below, the model learns very quickly and eventually achieves a validation accuracy of just over 98% and a mean IOU of just over 94%. So like the other models, the accuracy is quite good, and probably the most remarkable thing to comment on here is that the model achieves a very high accuracy after just about 10 epochs of training, which is mainly due to the fact that we used a pre-trained backbone from ImageNet, but it also speaks very well for the efficiency of the model itself. Finally, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the images from the inference results. And we really wouldn't expect them to be too much different from the previous examples, since the accuracy of all three models are quite high. But as we scroll through here, you can see that this model does seem to be a little more robust to some of the more difficult cases. In the final section of this notebook, we're going to summarize the results from all three models with this data set. And just looking at the training plots, it's not too surprising that the training required for UNet takes time to ramp up due to the larger number of training parameters required for that model and the fact that it was trained from scratch. But again, all three models have a very good accuracy, all of which are above 97%. One thing we thought would be interesting to take a look at is the way in which each model learns, which actually appears to be quite different. Here we ran each of these models for a limited number of epochs ranging from just a single epoch up to 16 epochs. And then for each trained model, we plotted the inference results for one of the images. So in the grid below, you can see the predicted grayscale binary segmentation maps, as well as the overlaid results in green on the original image for each of the three models. So first notice that the FCN32S results exhibit a very patchwork type pattern that is due to the extreme 32x upsampling which is performed to produce the final predictions. The UNet model exhibits an entirely different learning pattern which begins with a very noisy, non-contiguous estimation that is slowly refined. And then finally, with the DeeplabV3 Plus model, you can see that it appears to learn in contiguous blobs with much more density and accuracy after just a few epochs. So we just thought this was something interesting to take a look at. Just to summarize, keep in mind that this is considered a relatively easy segmentation problem. In the next few notebooks, we're going to train the DeeplabV3 Plus model on the CamVid dataset and see how that compares to the UNet results. And then we'll also train it on the underwater dataset and get a better feel for how difficult some of these multi-class datasets can be. And then finally, we'll experiment a little bit with tweaking the architecture by adding additional feature maps to the same processing pipelines within the model to see if we can further improve the results. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.